In the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, there lies an island that witnessed the birth of a new and terrible age. Tinian Island, a small speck of land barely 40 square miles in size, 1,500 miles south of Tokyo. By the summer of 1945, this tropical paradise had been transformed into something else entirely. 50,000 American personnel crowded onto its shores. 4 massive runways stretched across the landscape, each 8,500 feet long, capable of launching wave after wave of Boeing B-29 Super Fortress bombers into the skies toward Japan. The ground trembled constantly. Every 60 seconds, another bomber roared down the runway, engines screaming, overloaded with fuel for the 3,000-mile round trip to the Japanese mainland. The 20th Bomber Command had turned Tinian into the busiest airfield in the world, a launching pad for relentless attacks that had already reduced dozens of Japanese cities to ash and rubble. But in early August, something different was happening on this island, something that would change human history forever. The weapon was deceptively simple in its design. A gun-type fission device using uranium-235, it would work by firing one piece of uranium into another at tremendous speed, creating a supercritical mass that would unleash the power of the atom. Unlike the more complex plutonium implosion device being prepared for the second attack, Little Boy required no final arming before takeoff. If the bomber crashed, it wouldn't explode. This was a crucial consideration, given how common takeoff accidents had become with the overloaded bombers. The bomb weighed nearly 10,000 pounds and measured about 10 feet in length. Its development had required an incredible feat of engineering. Scientists had to enrich uranium to separate the rare uranium-235 isotope from the far more common uranium-238. This process alone had demanded massive industrial facilities at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, where electromagnetic separation plants and gaseous diffusion facilities worked around the clock. The amount of uranium-235 in Little Boy, approximately 64 kilograms, represented a significant portion of America's entire stockpile of the material. Based on production schedules, another uranium bomb wouldn't be ready until December. On August 5th, the bomb was maneuvered into position over one of the specially constructed loading pits at North Field. These pits, still visible today on Tinian, allowed the massive weapon to be hoisted up into the bomb bay of the B-29. The aircraft selected for this historic mission was number 44-86-292. On May 9th, Lieutenant Colonel Paul W. Tibbets, Jr., commander of the 509th Composite Group, had personally selected this plane while it was still on the assembly line at the Glenn L. Martin bomber plant in Bellevue, Nebraska. Now, just hours before takeoff, Tibbets made a last-minute decision. He asked a maintenance worker to paint a name on the nose of the aircraft, the name of his mother, Enola Gay. The crew gathered for their final briefing. These men had been training for 9 months, though most still didn't know the true nature of their mission. They were part of the 509th Composite Group, a unit created specifically for this purpose. They'd flown countless practice runs, dropping pumpkin bombs, massive conventional weapons designed to match the size and weight of the atomic device. They'd bombed targets at Kobe and Nagoya in July, perfecting their technique. But nothing could truly prepare them for what was coming. Tibbets had assembled an elite team of 12 crew members. His navigator, Captain Theodore Dutch Van Kirk, would plot their course with precision. Major Thomas Farabee would serve as bombardier, responsible for releasing the weapon at exactly the right moment. Captain Robert A. Lewis would serve as co-pilot. The rest of the crew included specialists in radar, radio operation, and flight engineering. Among them was Sergeant Joseph Stiberich, a Czech-American radar operator whose family had immigrated from Moravia. And there was Captain Deke Parsons, the weaponeer from the Manhattan Project, who would have the crucial job of arming the bomb once they were airborne. The mission would include support aircraft. The great artiste would carry instrumentation and scientific observers, including Luis Alvarez, who would later win the Nobel Prize in Physics. Another B-29, later named Necessary Evil, would document the mission with cameras. Weather reconnaissance planes would scout ahead, reporting conditions over the potential targets. Everything had been planned down to the smallest detail. At 2:45 in the morning on August 6, 1945, floodlights illuminated North Field. Major General Leslie R. Groves, Jr., director of the Manhattan Project, wanted this moment recorded for posterity. The Enola Gay's 4 Wright R-3350 engines roared to life. Tibbets pulled the bomber as far back on runway Able as possible. He knew they would need every inch. With the weight of the bomb and the maximum fuel load, this takeoff would test the limits of the aircraft's capabilities. The big bomber began to roll. Faster and faster it accelerated down the concrete strip. The tail lifted. Then, with what seemed like agonizing slowness, the Enola Gay's wheels left the ground. She was airborne. 3 other B-29s followed at intervals. They rendezvoused over Iwo Jima at 8,000 feet, then set course for Japan. The 6-hour flight gave the crew time to contemplate what lay ahead. Somewhere over the Pacific, Tibbets handed out capsules of cyanide in case they were shot down and captured. Then he revealed the truth. They were carrying an atomic bomb, a weapon with the explosive power equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. One bomb that could do what required 1,000 aircraft in conventional raids. At a 1.0 pace. Hiroshima. The name means wide island. The city sprawled across the delta where the Ota River divided into 7 channels before flowing into the inland sea. These waterways gave the place an almost Venetian quality, a city built on and around water. For its 350,000 inhabitants, this geographic feature was usually a blessing. The rivers provided commerce, transportation, and beauty. But on August 6, 1945, they would become something else: traps, barriers, graves. The city occupied a unique position in Japan's war effort. As the headquarters of the Second General Army, responsible for defending the entire western portion of Japan, Hiroshima held immense military importance. The Ujina port facilities handled military supplies and troop movements. Various industrial plants produced war materials. An estimated 40,000 soldiers were stationed in and around the city. This military significance had made Hiroshima a potential target for American bombing. Yet, remarkably, the city had been largely spared from the devastating firebombing campaigns that had reduced Tokyo, Osaka, and dozens of other Japanese cities to smoking ruins. Speculation ran wild about why Hiroshima had been spared. Some said it was because so many residents had immigrated to America and had connections there. Others whispered that President Truman's mother lived somewhere in the region. The truth was far more calculated and far more ominous. American planners needed pristine targets to assess the true destructive power of their new weapon. Cities that had already been bombed wouldn't provide clean data. Hiroshima, Kokura, Niigata, and Nagasaki had all been deliberately reserved, left untouched so that when the atomic bombs fell, scientists could study their effects on intact urban areas. The previous night had been restless for Hiroshima's residents. Air raid sirens had sounded repeatedly, forcing people from their beds to seek shelter. At 12:25 after midnight, the warnings began. Single reconnaissance planes were detected approaching the area. These were part of the American routine, photographing potential targets and assessing weather conditions. The all-clear wasn't sounded until 2:10 in the morning. People tried to sleep, but barely 5 hours later, at 7:09, the sirens wailed again. Another B-29 had been spotted. This was the Straight Flush, the weather reconnaissance plane for the Hiroshima mission. It circled high above the city, its crew observing and reporting. Conditions were excellent. Clear visibility, light winds, perfect for bombing. At 7:31, the all-clear sounded once more. The plane had departed without dropping any bombs. People emerged from shelters, exhausted from the interrupted sleep, and tried to resume their morning routines. They ate late breakfasts. They prepared for work. They had no way of knowing that the weather report from Straight Flush had just sealed their fate. The Japanese government, desperate as the war turned against them, had mobilized the nation's youth. Boys and girls as young as 12 and 13 had been pulled from their classrooms and put to work for the war effort. The older students, those in their third and fourth years, labored in military factories, producing munitions, aircraft parts, supplies for the front. The younger ones had a different task: building demolition. In preparation for the expected American invasion, or at least for continued firebombing raids, the government had ordered the creation of fire breaks throughout Japanese cities. Buildings would be torn down to create empty spaces that flames couldn't cross. It was grueling, dangerous work, done manually with ropes, saws, and simple hand tools. On the morning of August 6, 1945, the sixth phase of Hiroshima's building demolition project was underway. Approximately 8,000 students had been mobilized to work in the city center, many of them concentrated in an area less than half a mile from the spot that would become Ground Zero. At Hiroshima Prefectural First Girls High School, 541 first and second-year students gathered with their teachers at 7 in the morning. They assembled near what is now Peace Memorial Park, in areas then known as Zaimoku-cho and Kobiki-cho. The girls wore their school uniforms, sailor-style blouses with baggy work pants underneath. They carried their lunches. They said goodbye to their families, telling them they'd see them that evening. By 8 o'clock, they'd taken a brief rest in front of Seiganji Temple, about 500 meters from where the bomb would explode. at a 1.0x pace played out across the city. First-year students from Hiroshima Prefectural First Junior High School worked nearby. Students from the Municipal Commercial School and Municipal Shipbuilding Industry School labored close to the Hippocenter. 223 students from the Girls' Commercial School, including 13-year-old Fuji Yoneda, worked in the Dobashi district. Fuji had been keeping a diary, faithfully recording her daily life. Her last entry, written the night before, mentioned the demolition work starting the next day. She wrote about doing her best with lots of energy. The diary would end there. Not all students were engaged in building demolition. Some worked in other capacities for the war effort. 13-year-old Mitsuko Kochi, a second-year student at Hiroshima Girls' Commercial School, had been assigned to work at the Postal Savings Bureau building, a solid structure less than a kilometer from Ground Zero. She'd arrived early that morning with several of her classmates. They'd opened all the windows to let in the fresh air. Someone had remarked on what a beautiful day it was. Meanwhile, 32-year-old Yoshito Matsushige was at home in Midoricho, about 2.7 kilometers from the city center, just outside the 1.5-mile radius where total destruction would occur. Matsushige worked as a photographer for the Chugoku Shimbun newspaper and also served as a member of the press corps at the Chugoku Regional Military Headquarters. He'd spent the previous night on duty at Hiroshima Castle, where the military headquarters were located, monitoring for air raids. That morning, he'd returned home for breakfast with his pregnant wife, Sumie, who ran a barber shop from their residence. Across Hiroshima, 350,000 people went about their morning activities. Office workers commuted on crowded streetcars. Shop owners opened their businesses. Factory workers clocked in for their shifts. Mothers tended to children. The elderly sat in the shade, trying to escape the growing heat. Military personnel went about their duties at the various bases and headquarters. It was Monday, a workday, the beginning of another week in the 4th year of war with America. Few people paid much attention when, shortly after 8 o'clock, the air raid siren briefly sounded again. 3 B-29s had been detected approaching from the south. But 3 bombers didn't constitute a major raid. In recent months, the Americans had been sending hundreds of planes at a time to bomb Japanese cities. 3 planes likely meant another reconnaissance mission. The sirens fell silent. No need for alarm. The Enola Gay and its 2 escort aircraft flew at 31,000 feet, well above the range of Japanese anti-aircraft fire. Through breaks in the thin clouds, the crew could see Hiroshima spread out below them. The T-shaped Aioi Bridge, their aiming point, was clearly visible. Everything looked peaceful, normal. The city going about its business, unaware of what was descending from the sky. At 8:15 and 17 seconds in the morning, Bombardier Thomas Farabee pressed the release. Little Boy dropped free from the Enola Gay's bomb bay. The plane, suddenly lighter by nearly 10,000 pounds, lurched upward. Tibbets immediately threw the bomber into a sharp diving turn, a maneuver they'd practiced countless times. They needed distance, they needed speed, they needed to get away from what was about to happen. Little Boy fell for approximately 43 to 44 seconds, according to various accounts. The gun-type mechanism contained within its steel casing was armed and ready. At an altitude of approximately 1,968 feet above Hiroshima, the barometric and timing triggers activated. The firing mechanism drove the uranium projectile down the gun barrel into the uranium target rings. Critical mass was achieved. In that instant, matter converted to energy according to Einstein's equation. The temperature at the center of the explosion exceeded 1,000,000 degrees Celsius. A fireball formed, blazing like a small sun, reaching a radius of 200 meters within a single second. The surface temperature near the hypocenter rose to 3,000 to 4,000 degrees Celsius. The sky itself seemed to split open with light. The flash came first. Those who saw it directly described it as a blinding white light, brighter than anything they'd ever witnessed. Like 1,000 magnesium flares igniting simultaneously. For a fraction of a second, the world turned white. People who were inside saw the light flood through windows. Those outside were struck by what felt like physical blow from the sheer intensity of the radiant energy. Matsushige, standing shirtless in his home, about to dress for work, saw the electrical wiring inside his house light up as if struck by lightning. The world turned bright white. Then came what he described as feeling like hundreds of needles stabbing him all at once. The thermal pulse, traveling at the speed of light, scorched exposed skin even at his distance from the explosion. Closer to the hypocenter, people weren't burned. They simply vanished. Their bodies vaporized in the intense heat, leaving only shadows etched onto walls and pavement where they'd blocked the thermal radiation. Within a kilometer of ground zero, anyone outdoors died instantly. Their internal organs were fatally damaged by the intense heat penetrating their bodies. Clothing ignited, skin charred and peeled away. The lucky ones never knew what happened. Their nervous systems couldn't transmit pain signals fast enough. They were dead before the information reached their brains. At the Sumitomo Bank, 260 meters from the hypocenter, someone had been sitting on the stone steps waiting for the bank to open. The thermal radiation burned the surrounding stone, bleaching it lighter. But where the person's body blocked the intense light, the stone remained its original darker color. A shadow in the shape of a human being was permanently etched into the steps. Based on witness accounts, a soldier later recovered remains from that location, suggesting the person who cast that shadow died almost instantly from the intense heat. The thermal pulse lasted only a few seconds, but those seconds were enough to inflict terrible damage across vast distances. As far as 2.2 miles from ground zero, the 3-second burst of heat burned exposed skin. Clothing color mattered. Dark colors absorbed more heat, causing worse burns. People wearing patterned fabric received burns in the pattern of their clothes. White fabric reflected more radiation, providing some protection. But at closer distances, nothing offered protection. Nothing could. The fireball expanded, drawing in surrounding air to feed its growth. The intense heat ignited fires throughout the city. Buildings caught flame. Wood structures burst into inferno. Paper and cloth turned to ash. Within seconds, hundreds of fires had started. And this was just the beginning. 13-year-old Mitsuko Kochi, inside the Postal Savings Bureau building, heard no sound. She simply saw the brilliant flash through the windows. Then everything went dark. The building's structure held, being made of reinforced concrete, but every window shattered simultaneously. The blast wave, traveling behind the thermal pulse at supersonic speed, struck with tremendous force. Flying glass became deadly projectiles. Mitsuko felt herself thrown across the room. Sharp pain in her arm. When she could see again, she realized she was bleeding heavily. Her friend collapsed beside her, blood pouring from a head wound, saying her skull had split open. The blast wave moved outward from the hypocenter at speeds exceeding 1,000 miles per hour near ground zero, slowing as it expanded, but still carrying tremendous destructive force. Within a mile of the explosion, the overpressure exceeded 5 pounds per square inch, enough to demolish most buildings. Wooden structures simply disintegrated, their components scattered like toys. Even reinforced concrete buildings had their interiors gutted. Across the demolition sites in the city center, thousands of other students died in the same instant. The first-year boys from the junior high schools, the students from the commercial schools. They'd been working in the open, completely exposed, at precisely the worst possible locations. The very work meant to prepare the city for attack had placed them directly in harm's way. The pressure wave continued outward. At the Hiroshima Castle military headquarters, the blast destroyed the wooden structures housing the command staff and killed everyone inside. Of the 40,000-plus soldiers stationed in Hiroshima, approximately 6,800 died immediately or went missing. The blast flattened 60,000 buildings and structures within a 2-kilometer radius. The downtown area simply ceased to exist as a recognizable urban landscape. Then came the wind. The blast wave didn't just push outward. The sudden expansion of air created a vacuum at the center, and once the initial shock wave passed, wind rushed back toward the hypocenter. This secondary wind reached speeds of 30 to 40 miles per hour, fanning the hundreds of fires that had started, causing them to merge and grow. Within 20 minutes of the explosion, a massive firestorm developed, consuming everything combustible across 11 square kilometers. Matsushige, thrown to the floor by the blast, struggled to his feet amid the debris. His house had been damaged but not destroyed. Large holes gaped in the walls where the blast had punched through. The room was filled with dust and debris. He dug through the rubble to retrieve his camera, a Mamiya 6 folding camera, and the clothes he wore for his military press corps duties. He dressed quickly, grabbed 2 rolls of film with 24 possible exposures each, and headed for the door. As a photojournalist and military press corps member, he felt compelled to document whatever had just happened. Outside, the world had changed. A huge cloud was rising into the sky, forming the distinctive mushroom shape that would become synonymous with nuclear explosions. The cloud would eventually reach about 7.5 miles high, visible from over 200 miles away. But Matsushige couldn't see the mushroom cloud from his position. He was too close, directly beneath it. What he saw instead was darkness. Smoke and dust so thick that visibility dropped to almost nothing. Though it was only around 8:15 in the morning, it looked like twilight. 20-year-old Sunao Tsuboi had been less than a kilometer from ground zero when the bomb exploded. The thermal radiation struck him with full force, burning his face and back severely. The blast wave threw him into a ditch, potentially saving his life by shielding him from the worst effects. When he regained consciousness, he found himself in a nightmare world. Everything around him was destroyed. Fires burned everywhere. And the people were the worst part. Those who survived the initial flash and blast were left with injuries beyond imagination. The thermal radiation had caused third-degree burns across large portions of their bodies. The intense heat had caused their skin to blister immediately, the blisters bursting and leaving raw, exposed flesh. But because the thermal pulse was so brief, the heat hadn't penetrated deeply. The burns were surface wounds, but they covered vast areas of the body. Arms, legs, faces, backs, anywhere exposed to the direct thermal radiation. The skin would begin to peel away in sheets, hanging from people's arms and legs like rags. When witnesses later described what they saw, they said it looked like clothing hanging down, but it was actually skin. The raw flesh underneath turned reddish and began weeping plasma. People walked with their arms held out in front of them, hands dangling, trying to minimize the pain of movement. They moved slowly, in a daze, many calling for water, for help, for their mothers. The injuries were compounded by the effects of the blast. Flying debris had struck people, causing lacerations and puncture wounds. Collapsing buildings had crushed or trapped victims. Those inside structures, when they collapsed, found themselves buried alive, unable to escape as fires approached. The screams of people trapped in burning buildings filled the air. Others tried desperately to dig through rubble to reach loved ones, but the fires forced them back. People fled in every direction, seeking escape from the flames and the destruction. Many headed toward the rivers, thinking the water would provide safety. They jumped in to cool their burns, but many were too weak to swim and drowned. Bodies began to accumulate in the waterways, floating downstream toward the sea. Others tried to reach the outskirts of the city, but the sheer scale of the destruction made navigation difficult. Streets were blocked by rubble. Familiar landmarks had vanished. The entire city center had been reduced to a flattened, burning wasteland. Matsushige tried to reach his office at the Chugoku Shimbun newspaper in the downtown area. He made it about 400 meters before the intensity of the fires forced him back. The heat was simply too intense to approach. Flames roared from every building. The air itself seemed to shimmer with heat. He could hear explosions as gas lines ruptured and fuel stores ignited. The destruction was so complete, so overwhelming, that he couldn't process what he was seeing. He turned back, heading south toward Miyuki Bridge, about 1.5 miles from the Hippo Center. This route took him parallel to the expanding firestorm rather than directly into it. As he walked, he passed countless injured people. Some were already dead, sprawled on the ground where they'd collapsed. Others moved like ghosts, their faces blank, their bodies terribly burned. The walking wounded streamed past him, heading away from the city center, seeking help, seeking safety, seeking anything to end the nightmare. Near Miyuki Bridge, Matsushige encountered a scene that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The bridge had become a gathering point for survivors. As the closest safe crossing point away from the firestorm, people naturally converged there. But safe was a relative term. The bridge offered no shelter, no medical care, no relief from the horror. It was simply a place that hadn't been completely destroyed, and it was rapidly filling with the burned, the bleeding, and the dying. Miyuki Bridge stretched across one of the Ota River's channels, connecting the downtown area to the southern districts. In normal times, it was just another bridge, one of many that crisscrossed Hiroshima's water-laced geography. But on the morning of August 6, 1945, it became something more. A line between the inferno consuming the city center and the relative safety beyond. A gathering place for thousands seeking escape from the flames. A makeshift hospital without walls, without supplies, without hope. A place where people came to find help and found instead only other desperate victims. By the time Matsushige reached the western end of Miyuki Bridge around 11 o'clock, 3 hours after the explosion, the scene was overwhelming. Hundreds of people crowded the approaches to the bridge and the bridge itself. The burned, the blast-injured, the radiation-poisoned, though no one yet understood what radiation sickness meant. They sat, stood, or lay where they'd collapsed, many too weak to go farther. Most striking were the children. So many children. Students in their uniforms, or what remained of their uniforms. The fabric had been burned away in many cases, leaving them effectively naked, their skin hanging in sheets from their arms and legs. Hair singed away or standing on end where it hadn't been completely burned off. Faces barely recognizable as human, swollen and raw from thermal burns. A temporary relief station had been set up near the police box at the western end of the bridge. Police officers and military personnel who'd escaped the blast were attempting to provide first aid, but their resources were pathetically inadequate. They had no medical supplies to speak of, no morphine for pain, no bandages, no antibiotics, not even clean water in sufficient quantities. What they did have was cooking oil. Someone had brought containers of rapeseed oil, the kind used in cooking. In desperate circumstances, this became their treatment for burns. The theory was sound enough. Oil could soothe damaged skin and provide a barrier against infection. But the quantity was woefully insufficient for the number of victims. Police officers and soldiers dipped their hands into the buckets and tried to spread the oil on burned skin. But there were too many victims, far too many burns. The precious rapeseed oil was soon exhausted. They improvised. Someone suggested using motor oil from vehicles. It was oil, after all. Dark, thick motor oil, completely unsuitable for medical use, was retrieved from the nearby train depot. This became the treatment of last resort. They smeared it on burns, turning the victim's skin black, making them look even more monstrous than their injuries already had. But it was something, some kind of action in the face of overwhelming catastrophe. Matsushige stood at the edge of this scene, his camera in his hands. As a photographer for the military press corps, he had a duty to document what had occurred. This was clearly a major attack of some kind, though no one yet understood it was an atomic bomb. The military would need photographs for their records, for their analysis, for their reports. And as a journalist, he felt the professional obligation to record this historic moment. But he couldn't do it. He stood there for 20 minutes, maybe 30, unable to press the shutter. These were his neighbors, his fellow citizens. Many were children. They were in the worst agony imaginable, their bodies devastated, dying slowly in full view of everyone. How could he photograph them in this state? What right did he have to capture their suffering? Would they think him heartless, taking pictures instead of helping? But what help could he offer? He had no medical training, no supplies, nothing but his camera. The internal struggle tore at him. His tears clouded the viewfinder. Finally, steeling himself, knowing this moment had to be preserved somehow, he raised the camera and pressed the shutter. Click. One exposure. Then he moved a few meters closer and took another. 2 photographs of the scene on and around Miyuki Bridge, captured between 11 and 11:30 on the morning of August 6, 1945. These would be the only photographs taken on the ground in Hiroshima that day. The only images that captured the actual victims, the human cost, the individual faces of those who suffered under the atomic cloud. Matsushige would attempt to take more photographs later that day, managing only 3 more frames before the horror overwhelmed him completely and he returned home. Of the 7 total exposures he made that day, only 5 would successfully develop. The other 2 were damaged when he tried to develop the film 20 days later in a stream at night, working in secret because photographing the aftermath of the bombing was illegal. But those 2 photographs taken at Miyuki Bridge would become iconic. They would be the first images the world saw of what an atomic bomb did to human beings. When Japan's surrender ended the American occupation's censorship in 1952, these photographs appeared in Life magazine under the headline, "When Atom Bomb Struck, Uncensored." They shocked the world. They still shock today, because they show what words cannot adequately describe. In the foreground of the first photograph, a man in uniform stands with his back to the camera. He's wearing what appears to be military-style clothing and a cap. His posture suggests he's engaged in the relief efforts, probably one of the civil defense workers applying oil to burns. To his left, closer to the camera, another figure crouches near a container. This is the bucket of oil, and the person is treating someone out of frame. Behind them, the bridge itself is crowded with people. Most sit or lie on the ground. Many have their heads down, too exhausted or too injured to move. The distinctive feature that draws the eye is the number of young people visible. School uniforms are evident on several figures. Some appear to be junior high school age, perhaps 13 or 14 years old. Others might be even younger. One girl stands out particularly. She wears a school uniform and has her back to the camera. Researchers later identified her as 13-year-old Mitsuko Kochi, the second-year student from Hiroshima Girls Commercial School, who'd been injured at the Postal Savings Bureau. She made it to Miyuki Bridge with several of her classmates, seeking treatment for their injuries. The scarf she wears is unusual, not part of the standard Hiroshima school uniform. It was a gift from a cousin who worked at a police station in Yamaguchi. In the photograph, her sleeve is torn and her arm bleeding. Another figure visible in the photographs is 20-year-old Sunao Tsuboi. He sits with his head raised, looking toward something out of frame. His closely cropped hair is visible, and though the photograph doesn't show it clearly, his face and back bear severe radiation burns. Tsuboi would later explain what everyone at the bridge was waiting for, what they were doing there in their silent suffering. They'd come for the oil treatment. The civil defense workers had been instructed to treat burn victims this way. It was the best they could do with no proper medical supplies. The rapeseed oil had been brought from nearby homes and businesses. When it ran out, they sent runners to get more. When even that proved insufficient, they resorted to the motor oil. People lined up as best they could, waiting their turn to have the thick, dark oil spread on their burns. It offered minimal actual benefit, but it was something, some gesture of care in the midst of chaos. But many were too weak even to wait. They simply collapsed where they were. On the bridge, along its approaches, scattered across the area like fallen leaves. Some had succumbed to their injuries. Others were dying slowly, their life force ebbing away. Still others merely lacked the strength to move any farther. The bridge became not just a crossing point, but a holding area for those who could neither advance nor retreat. Water was scarce. People begged for it constantly. Their burned throats and mouths were parched. The thermal radiation had dehydrated them terribly. Some tried to reach the river below the bridge, thinking they could drink or at least cool themselves in the water. A few made it down to the riverbank. Many of these, too exhausted to swim or even stand in the current, drowned. Their bodies joined the others floating in the Ota's channels, drifting toward the sea. The silence was what struck many observers most profoundly. With so many people gathered, you'd expect noise. Crying, screaming, talking. But most victims were too weak, too shocked to make much sound. They sat or lay in near total silence, broken only by occasional moans of pain or whispered calls for water, for help, for family members. The quiet was more disturbing than screaming would have been. Mitsuko Kochi would remember this silence vividly when she spoke about her experience decades later. She recalled that nobody was talking. Everyone sat facing downward. Some cried from pain, but quietly. She remembered thinking that everyone looked like monsters. The burns had swollen faces beyond recognition. Skin hung from bodies in grotesque sheets. Some people were naked or nearly so, their clothing having been burned away. They were covered in blood, in oil, in dirt and ash. The human form twisted into shapes that didn't look human anymore. One image burned into Mitsuko's memory above all others. A young woman, perhaps an older sister, holding an infant in her arms. The woman had her hair tied up in a ponytail or bun. She was crying and spinning around, clutching the child to her chest. The baby was dead, its small body blackened by burns. But the woman wouldn't accept it. She kept crying out the child's name, saying, "Wake up, wake up." She begged the infant to open its eyes. But of course, the baby never woke. This scene played out in variations across the bridge. Parents searching for children. Children searching for parents. Families separated in the chaos, each member desperately hoping the others had survived. Some reunions occurred. Most did not. The scale of the disaster made finding anyone nearly impossible. With most of the city center destroyed and landmarks obliterated, people couldn't even determine where their homes had been. As the morning progressed, the military organized evacuation efforts, but with a cruel calculus. Lieutenant Goro Kakuuchi,
A 22-year-old Army cadet stationed in a suburb of Hiroshima arrived at Miyuki Bridge with 100 other soldiers around midday. They'd been ordered to assist with evacuation of victims. But when Takeuchi received his specific orders, he was shocked by what he was told. Prioritize military personnel, young men who could still fight. Women, children, and the elderly were less important. They should wait. The military logic was coldly practical. Japan was losing the war. They needed every soldier they could save for the final defense of the homeland. Resources were limited. Trucks and medical supplies had to go to those who could still serve the war effort. Civilians, especially those unlikely to recover enough to contribute meaningfully, were lower priority. Takeuchi found himself unable to follow these orders strictly. Standing on Miyuki Bridge, surrounded by dying children, he couldn't simply leave them to load soldiers onto trucks. He remembered one incident in particular. A small girl approached one of the military vehicles. She was alone, badly burned, clearly terrified. She asked for help. A soldier in the truck shouted at her harshly to go away. The severity in his voice frightened the girl, and she began to cry. Then she turned and ran back toward the city center, toward the fires still burning. What happened to her? Takeuchi knew. She died, of course. How could she not? Even adults couldn't survive going back into that inferno. A small child alone, already injured, had no chance whatsoever. But the military couldn't save everyone. Hard choices had to be made. That's what Takeuchi told himself. But the memory of that little girl running toward the flames haunted him for the rest of his life. Among those visible in the photograph is a young boy. He sits with his back to the camera, head shaved close in the style common for schoolboys. His posture suggests exhaustion or injury. Researchers studying the photograph believe they've identified him. His name was Akira Kutsuki. He was a student at the national school attached to Hiroshima Normal School's boys' division. He was on his way to school when the bomb exploded. Rie Kutsuki, Akira's relative who was born decades after the bombing, grew up knowing about this photograph. Her family had recognized Akira in the image, identified by his distinctive ears that stuck out slightly from his head and his characteristic slouch. They'd seen the photograph published in newspapers and magazines over the years. Each time, they looked at that boy's back and knew it was him. But Akira never came home. His body was never found. The photograph is the only evidence that he survived the initial blast long enough to reach Miyuki Bridge. What happened to him after Matsushige took the picture remains unknown. This was the cruelty of the atomic bomb on a personal level. When large numbers of people die simultaneously in a disaster, individual fates become impossible to trace. Families could spend years, decades, the rest of their lives searching for closure, for any information about what happened to their loved one in those final hours. Most would never find answers. The dead were simply too numerous, the destruction too complete, the chaos too overwhelming for individual stories to be preserved. Looking at the photographs, medical experts can now analyze the visible injuries and understand the types of trauma these victims suffered. The thermal burns are immediately apparent. The skin damage, the swelling, the raw exposed flesh where protective layers have been stripped away. These are third-degree burns, among the most serious possible.
The thermal pulse from the atomic bomb was unique in its effects. Unlike a conventional fire, which burns over time, the nuclear flash delivered intense heat almost instantaneously, for just a few seconds. This meant the burns were severe but relatively shallow. The surface tissue was destroyed, but deeper structures often remained intact, at least initially. Dr. Harada, a surgeon and emergency medicine specialist in Osaka who has studied the Matsushige photographs, points out specific details visible in the images. The burned hair on many victims, frizzed and singed. The way clothing appears to hang from bodies in tatters, though closer examination reveals this is actually skin peeling away in sheets. The posture of people holding their arms out away from their bodies, a classic sign of severe burns. When skin is burned badly enough, any contact, even clothes touching it, causes intense pain. Victims naturally hold their burned limbs in positions that minimize contact. The radiation exposure, though not directly visible in photographs, would have been significant for anyone at Miyuki Bridge who'd been outdoors near the hypocenter. Gamma rays and neutrons released at the moment of detonation penetrated living tissue, damaging cellular DNA. But the acute effects of radiation poisoning wouldn't manifest immediately. That would come in the days and weeks ahead, as victims developed the suite of symptoms that became known as radiation sickness. As Matsushige prepared to take his second photograph, moving a few meters closer to the victims, tears blurred his viewfinder. He recalled this moment clearly when interviewed decades later. The emotional weight of what he was doing, photographing people in their worst moment of suffering, nearly prevented him from completing the task. He felt torn between his duty as a photojournalist and his humanity as a person. These people were looking at him, he felt. Their eyes seemed to be asking him to tell the world what had happened to them, to bear witness, to make sure their suffering wasn't forgotten. Or were they judging him for pointing a camera instead of offering help? He pressed the shutter one final time at the bridge, then left. He couldn't take any more photographs there. The emotional and psychological toll was too great. Later that day, he would manage to take 3 more photographs. One of his wife Sumi cleaning debris from their damaged barber shop, another of the destroyed fire station visible from his window, and a final image of a wounded police officer distributing rice ration certificates near the bridge. Then he was done. The camera returned to its case. The horror too overwhelming to continue documenting. Those 5 photographs that survived the development process represent the only ground-level images taken in Hiroshima on August 6, 1945, that show actual victims. The only visual record of what it was like to be there, under the mushroom cloud, in the hours immediately following the explosion. American military photographers would later document the destruction of buildings and the overall devastation, but they arrived weeks later. The immediate human suffering, the individual faces of the dead and dying, the specific moment when a city's population confronted nuclear war for the first time in human history, all of that exists in visual form only in Matsushige's 5 frames. The photographs were illegal. During wartime Japan, photographing anything that might damage public morale was forbidden. Images of dead bodies, destroyed cities, defeated soldiers, all strictly prohibited. The military police actively suppressed such material. But Matsushige kept his negatives hidden.
After the war, when American occupation forces arrived, they confiscated most photographs and newsreel footage of the bombing's aftermath. They missed many of the negatives, though. Photographers had learned to separate negatives from prints, hiding them in different locations. Matsushige's negatives survived, carefully preserved despite the risk. The physical film deteriorated badly over the years. By the 1970s, the negatives were severely damaged. A painstaking restoration effort saved them from total loss. Modern digital technology has allowed even more detailed analysis. Enhancement techniques can bring out details invisible in the original prints. Researchers can zoom in on faces, identify objects, reconstruct the scene with three-dimensional modeling. Each new examination reveals something previously unnoticed. But technology cannot answer the fundamental questions these photographs raise. What were these people feeling? What were they thinking? Did they understand what had happened to them? Did they know about atomic bombs, about radiation, about the new era of warfare they'd unwillingly inaugurated? Or did they simply know pain, confusion, fear, and loss? At a 1.0 ax, the children haunt these photographs most powerfully. Their presence at Miyuki Bridge in such numbers raises the question, why were so many young people caught in the blast? The answer lies in Japan's increasingly desperate mobilization of its entire population for the war effort. By 1945, Japan had been at war for 8 years, first with China, then with the Western Allies. The conflict had consumed the nation's resources and manpower. Every able-bodied man of military age had long since been conscripted. The military was scraping the bottom of the barrel, calling up men in their 30s and 40s who'd initially been exempted. This left enormous gaps in the civilian workforce. The government's solution was student mobilization. Beginning in 1943, students were systematically pulled from schools and put to work. Older students, third and fourth year junior high and high school students, went to munitions factories. They operated machinery, assembled weapons, and produced military supplies. Younger students, first and second years, were assigned to support roles that didn't require technical skills but still helped the war effort. In Hiroshima, this meant building demolition. The government had ordered cities to create fire breaks, open spaces that would prevent flames from spreading during the firebombing raids that had devastated Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, and dozens of other Japanese cities. Buildings would be torn down manually, creating vacant lots across which fire could not easily jump. It was hard, dangerous labor. Students worked with ropes and saws, pulling down wooden houses, clearing the debris, salvaging materials for reuse. The sixth phase of Hiroshima's demolition project began in early August 1945. According to city records, approximately 15,000 people were mobilized for this work, including large numbers of students. On the morning of August 6th, thousands of these young people gathered at demolition sites across the downtown area. Many worked in the zone between 500 and 1,000 meters from the Hippocenter. They were outdoors, completely exposed when Little Boy detonated. The tragedy of these mobilized students was compounded by their age and their trust in authority. These were children who'd been taught their entire lives to obey, to serve the nation, to sacrifice for the emperor and the war effort. They'd been told that their demolition work was essential, that they were helping to defend their country. They believed it. They went to their work sites dutifully, even eagerly in some cases, wanting to contribute, wanting to prove themselves. Fuji Yoneda had written in her diary about doing her best with energy. She looked forward to helping, despite the hard work. Other students recorded similar sentiments. They saw themselves as junior soldiers, doing their part just as their fathers and older brothers were doing theirs at the front. The propaganda had been thorough and effective. Japan's children had been trained to think of themselves as tools of the state, willing to endure hardship and danger for the greater good.
None of them could have imagined what was actually coming. Firebombing, yes. Conventional explosions, certainly. But an atomic bomb? A single weapon that could destroy an entire city in seconds? Such a thing didn't exist in their understanding of the world. So they gathered at their work sites that morning, said goodbye to their families, promised to be home for dinner. And they died, thousands of them, before they understood what was happening. Mitsuo Kodama, 13 years old at the time, survived the blast at his school. The building was only 800 meters from the hypocenter, but he'd been inside, which provided some shielding. He was badly burned and lost consciousness. When he woke, he was alone among the dead and dying. His classmates, those who'd been outside or near windows, were gone. Kodama would spend the rest of his life trying to honor their memory, trying to make sure people remembered what happened to the children of Hiroshima. Professor Keiko Otani, a researcher who has spent years studying the age distribution of atomic bomb victims, confirmed what the photographs and testimonies suggested. 22% of those killed on August 6th were adolescents, with most between 13 and 14 years old. The graph of casualties by age shows a distinctive spike at this range. These were the mobilized students caught in the open at their work sites. When you see the spike in the data, when you visualize all those young lives represented as a statistical anomaly in the mortality curve, the full horror comes into focus. These weren't soldiers. They weren't military targets. They were children who should have been in school, learning mathematics and literature and history. Instead, they were tearing down buildings with hand tools, and they happened to be doing it when the atomic age began. The monuments scattered around Hiroshima today memorialize these lost students. The memorial tower to the mobilized students stands south of the atomic bomb dome. 30 different schools have their own monuments scattered across the city. Hiroshima First Municipal Girls High School suffered the worst losses. 676 students and teachers killed, with 541 of those being first- and second-year students mobilized for demolition work. Not a single one of the students working near Ground Zero that morning survived. The aftermath was made even more painful by the impossibility of recovering remains. In the zone closest to the hypocenter, the intense heat had effectively cremated bodies, scattering the ashes. Blast effects distributed debris across wide areas. Fires consumed much of what remained. When families searched for their children, they often found nothing. No body to bury. No remains to cremate properly according to Buddhist tradition. No closure whatsoever. Just absence and the terrible certainty that their child was dead, and the haunting question of how much they had suffered. Some families got luckier, if such a word can be used. They found their child at a hospital or aid station, alive but badly injured. These reunions were bittersweet. Many of these children died in the following days or weeks from their injuries or from radiation sickness. But at least their families could be with them at the end, could hear their voices one last time, could hold their hands, could perform proper funeral rites.
At a 1.0-year-old son, Hiroaki, was found at Miyuki Bridge, badly burned from head to toe. He was evacuated to Ninoshima Island, where a relief station had been established. His father located him there and stayed with him. Hiroaki died on August 10th, 4 days after the bombing, with his father and grandmother watching over him. The shovel Hiroaki had been using at the demolition site survived and was later donated to the Peace Memorial Museum. A simple tool, a reminder of the mundane work he'd been doing when the extraordinary occurred. On Miyuki Bridge that morning, many of the young people gathered weren't mobilized students. Some were simply going about their daily activities when the bomb exploded. Others were students at schools farther from the Hippo Center, who'd been injured by flying glass or falling debris and had fled to the bridge seeking help. But the concentration of junior high school uniforms, the distinctive sailor-style blouses worn by girls, the close-cropped hair of the boys, all indicated that students formed a significant portion of the victims gathered there. They waited, mostly in silence, as the adults did, too weak, too shocked to make much noise. Some cried quietly. Many called for water. A few called for their parents, hoping somehow that their mother or father would appear and make everything better, the way parents had always done when they were hurt or scared. But their parents were scattered across the city, many dead or injured themselves, unable to come to their children's aid. The children at Miyuki Bridge represented just a fraction of the total student casualties. Most of the mobilized students working near Ground Zero never made it out of the destruction zone. They died where they stood, or they died trying to flee the fires, or they died trapped under collapsed buildings. Those who reached the bridge were the ones who'd been working farther out, or who'd been shielded somehow, or who'd simply been extraordinarily lucky in the chaos.
As the day progressed and more evacuations occurred, many of these children left the bridge, transported to hospitals or aid stations in surrounding towns. Some were claimed by family members who'd survived and searched for them. But others remained, too weak to move, too injured to transport, or simply overlooked in the chaos as priorities shifted to saving those who seemed to have better chances of survival. Night fell on Hiroshima. The fires still burned in the city center, turning the sky orange. At Miyuki Bridge, those who remained faced darkness, pain, fear, and uncertainty. Some died during the night. Others survived until morning. The second day brought new horrors as radiation sickness began to manifest. Vomiting, diarrhea, bleeding from the gums and nose, hair falling out, purple spots on the skin, a mysterious plague that no one understood. Looking back at the photographs now, knowing what came after, the faces of those children carry additional weight. They didn't just suffer burns and blast injuries. They absorbed radiation that would affect many of them for the rest of their lives, however long or short those lives would be. Some would die within days from acute radiation syndrome. Others would survive initially only to develop cancers years or decades later. Even those who escaped serious immediate injury, if they'd been within a certain distance of the hypocenter, carried a lifetime risk of radiation-induced illness.
The children of Hiroshima became symbols of the atomic bomb's indiscriminate cruelty. They didn't choose war. They didn't make military decisions. They were simply born in a particular place at a particular time, and that accident of geography condemned them. Their stories, preserved in testimonies and in Matsushige's photographs, serve as evidence of what nuclear weapons do, not just to cities and infrastructure, but to individual human beings, to the most vulnerable, to those with their whole lives ahead of them, at a 1.0 pace. Modern technology has allowed researchers to extract more information from Matsushige's photographs than was possible when they were first developed. Digital enhancement reveals details invisible in the original prints. Figures that appeared as shadows can be identified as individual people. Objects can be recognized. The position of the sun can be calculated, confirming the time of day. Three-dimensional reconstructions of the scene can be created, placing the photographs in geographic and temporal context. But beyond the technical analysis, the photographs have also sparked decades of detective work by historians, journalists, and survivors seeking to identify the people visible in the frames. Who were they? What were their names? What happened to them after Matsushige took these pictures? For some, answers have been found. For others, the mystery remains. Mitsuko Kochi came forward publicly in 1973 when the photographs were exhibited in Hiroshima. She identified herself as the schoolgirl in uniform with her back to the camera in the first photograph. She was 86 years old when she died in 2018, having spent her later years speaking at elementary schools about her experience of the atomic bombing. Her testimony added crucial context to what's happening in the photograph. She explained that she and several of her classmates from Hiroshima Girls Commercial School had fled from the Postal Savings Bureau building where they'd been working. Their injuries from flying glass were severe but not immediately life-threatening. They reached Miyuki Bridge and joined the crowds gathered there. The scarf she wore, visible in the photograph, was a gift from a cousin in the police force. It wasn't part of her school uniform, which is one reason she could confidently identify herself. Her memories of the bridge emphasized the silence, the grotesque appearance of burn victims, and one particular incident that haunted her forever. The young woman spinning around crying, holding a dead infant, calling the child's name, begging it to wake up. Mitsuko felt deep guilt about not trying to help that woman, but what could she have done? She was 13 years old, injured herself, surrounded by death and suffering on a scale beyond comprehension. But the guilt remained. 7 decades later, she still thought about that mother and child every single day. Another survivor visible in the photographs, a classmate of Mitsuko's, preferred to remain anonymous even in her 80s. She spoke with researchers, but asked that her name not be used. Her reasoning was simple. People wouldn't understand the misery, even if she told them. The horror was so profound, so beyond normal human experience, that trying to explain it felt futile. Better to remain silent, to keep the memories private, to not have to relive the trauma by discussing it publicly. These beliefs led to discrimination. Hibakusha faced difficulties in marriage. Families of potential spouses would sometimes reject matches if they learned the person was an atomic bomb survivor. Employment discrimination occurred. Medical problems, even those unrelated to radiation exposure, were sometimes attributed to their hibakusha status. The victims of the atomic bombings found themselves victimized again by social prejudice. This created a cruel paradox. These were people who'd survived one of history's worst atrocities. They carried physical and psychological scars that would never fully heal. They needed support, understanding, and compassion. Instead, many faced rejection and isolation. Speaking about their experiences risked identifying themselves as hibakusha, exposing themselves to discrimination. So many chose silence. They kept their stories to themselves, sharing them only with close family, if at all. The Japanese government did establish support systems for hibakusha. Medical care was provided. A monthly allowance. Special assistance for those whose illnesses could be directly linked to radiation exposure. But these programs also required official registration as a hibakusha, which many were reluctant to do precisely because of the social stigma. 20-year-old Sunao Tsuboi, visible in the Miyuki Bridge photograph as the young man with the closely cropped hair, sitting and looking towards something off-camera, eventually became a prominent activist for nuclear disarmament. But his path there took decades. Like many survivors, he initially kept his experiences private. The psychological burden of survival, combined with the physical suffering from his burns and radiation exposure, made it difficult to function normally in post-war society. Tsuboi explained years later what people were doing at the bridge that morning. They were waiting for medical treatment, specifically the application of oil to their burns. He watched as the rapeseed oil ran out and workers began using motor oil instead. He saw people grow weaker, saw them collapse, saw them die. He himself scratched a message on the bridge with a stone, recording his name and the fact that he was dying there. He felt utterly alone, convinced no one would help him, that he would die at age 20 with his body never identified or returned to his family. But he survived. Somehow, against the odds, he lived through that day and the days that followed. He endured the radiation sickness, the infections, the long recovery. And eventually, he found a purpose. He would speak about what happened. He would work to ensure the world never forgot Hiroshima. He would advocate for the abolition of nuclear weapons. He became one of the most prominent hibakusha activists, speaking to audiences around the world, including at the United Nations. Tsuboi's face bore the permanent scars of his burns. When people met him, they could see immediately that something terrible had happened to him. He couldn't hide his hibakusha status, even if he'd wanted to. Perhaps that made it easier for him to speak openly. Or perhaps he simply possessed exceptional courage and commitment. Either way, his testimony helped put faces and voices to the abstract statistics of atomic warfare. The identification of the young boy as Akira Kutsuki came from family members who recognized his distinctive features. His older brother's daughter, Rie Kutsuki, grew up knowing about the photograph. The family had seen it in newspapers and magazines over the years. Each time, they recognized Akira by his ears and his posture.
Rie explained that her grandparents had heard repeatedly from people asking why Akira never came home, since he was clearly alive in the photograph.
But the photograph only proved he was alive at that specific moment, probably around 11 in the morning. It said nothing about what happened to him in the hours or days that followed. He could have died later that day from his injuries. He could have been evacuated to a hospital and died there. He could have died weeks later from radiation sickness. His body could have been cremated in a mass funeral, his ashes mixed with thousands of others. The exact circumstances of his death remain unknown. The family has no grave to visit, no remains to honor. Only the photograph of his back, proof that he made it to Miyuki Bridge and nothing more. This pattern repeated across Hiroshima. Families with partial information, fragments of stories, photographs, or documents that confirmed loved ones were alive at certain moments, but left their ultimate fate uncertain. The scale of the disaster made complete documentation impossible. Records were destroyed in the fires. Hospitals were overwhelmed. People died faster than they could be identified. Mass cremations disposed of remains without proper documentation. The chaos was simply too great. Modern forensic techniques can't help much with these old cases. There are no DNA databases from 1945. No dental records survived for most victims. Even if remains could be found and identified through modern means, most grave sites from that era are unknown or have been disturbed by decades of development and reconstruction. The missing will remain missing. Researchers have identified perhaps a dozen individuals visible in Matsushige's photographs. 3 were still alive in the early 2000s when intensive study of the photographs began. Several others had died in previous decades but left testimonies or were identified by family members. That leaves 30 or 40 visible individuals whose identities remain unknown. They are faces in a photograph, evidence of suffering, but anonymous. Behind each unknown face is a story as complex and tragic as those of the identified survivors, but one that will never be told. The photographs have been published worldwide countless times since 1952, when censorship ended. They appeared in Life magazine, bringing the reality of the atomic bombing to American audiences for the first time. They've been displayed in museums, used in documentaries, published in books and magazines. In 1995, they were included in atomic bomb exhibits that traveled internationally. In 2020, they were displayed at the Battleship Missouri Memorial in Pearl Harbor, bringing the story full circle to the site where America's war with Japan began. In 2021, the 5 negatives of Matsushige's photographs were designated as Hiroshima City Important Tangible Cultural Properties. The designation recognized their historical significance as irreplaceable witnesses to the atomic bombing. The negatives are now nominated for inclusion in UNESCO's Memory of the World International Register, which preserves documentary heritage of universal significance. The photographs have become iconic, specifically because they show what other documentation does not. Aerial photographs show destroyed buildings and burned districts. They communicate scale and physical damage. Later photographs taken by American military personnel weeks after the bombing show the ruins in detail. But Matsushige's images show the human face of the disaster. They show what happened to people.
They make the abstract concrete. They transform statistics into individuals.
Yet even these powerful images can't fully convey the reality of that day. A still photograph captures an instant frozen in time. It doesn't show the movement, the sounds, the smells. It doesn't convey the pain in its full intensity. It doesn't capture the psychological horror, the existential terror of confronting destruction on a scale previously unimaginable. The photographs are evidence, are testimony, are historical record, but they are also fundamentally limited. They can show us only a tiny slice of what occurred. That's why the testimonies of survivors remain so crucial. The photographs show us faces. The testimonies give those faces voices. Together, they create a more complete picture, though one that still falls short of full understanding. How could it be otherwise? Those who weren't there cannot truly comprehend what it was like. The best we can do is listen, learn, and remember. At a 1.0x, the medical analysis of Matsushige's photographs reveals details about the types of injuries visible and their likely causes. Dr. Harada, examining the images with the practiced eye of a surgeon and emergency medicine specialist, immediately recognized the signs of severe thermal burns across most of the visible victims. The burned and frizzled hair is a characteristic sign of flash exposure to intense heat. When hair is exposed to temperatures high enough, the proteins that make up its structure break down, causing it to curl, singe, and become brittle. The victims at Miyuki Bridge show this pattern clearly. Many have hair that stands on end or is frizzled into unusual shapes. Others have had their hair burned away entirely, leaving scalps exposed. The clothing in tatters is another sign, but Dr. Harada noted something that casual observers often miss. In many cases, what appears to be clothing hanging from bodies is actually skin. The thermal flash caused immediate blistering across large areas of exposed skin. These blisters burst almost as quickly as they formed, leaving sheets of dead epidermis that peeled away from the underlying tissue. This skin hung from arms and legs, creating an appearance that witnesses consistently described as looking like clothing or rags. The thermal burns from an atomic explosion differ from conventional fire burns in important ways. A house fire, or a conventional incendiary bomb, creates heat that builds over time and affects victims who remain in proximity to the flames for extended periods. The atomic flash, by contrast, delivered intense heat almost instantaneously, for just a few seconds. This meant the thermal energy didn't have time to penetrate deeply through tissue. The burns were severe, but relatively superficial. This actually made the injuries in some ways more painful. Third-degree burns, which destroy all layers of skin, actually damage or destroy nerve endings, reducing pain sensation in the affected area. The flash burns from the atomic bomb tended to create deep second-degree burns or shallow third-degree burns that left some nerve endings intact. These burns hurt intensely. Every movement, every touch, even air moving across the injured skin caused terrible pain. The positioning of victims visible in the photograph supports this analysis. Many sit or stand with their arms held away from their bodies, hands dangling limply.
This posture minimizes skin-to-skin contact, reducing pain. It's an instinctive response to severe burns. The body naturally tries to position itself to minimize discomfort. Dr. Harada also pointed out the pattern of burns visible on some victims. The thermal radiation traveled in straight lines from the hypocenter. Any object that blocked this radiation created a shadow, protecting whatever was behind it. This led to distinctive injury patterns. Someone wearing a patterned shirt might be burned in the pattern of the shirt, with dark colors absorbing more radiation and causing worse burns than light colors. Someone standing near a wall might be burned on one side but not the other. The shadows cast by objects appear as unburned areas on otherwise scorched skin. The radiation exposure, though not directly visible in the photographs, would have been significant.